Welcome to the Veteran Summit, Irene Lyon. I'm so thrilled to have you here, and there is so much we can learn from you, and the way that you particularly teach is so wonderful because it takes very complicated material and it makes it completely understandable, and you have all kinds of videos and blogs to further that understanding. But if we could just start with a basic, how you define trauma.
Sure thing, Jane. Thank you for having me. So trauma defined in my field of work, and I've studied a lot of body-based therapies and methodologies and modalities. So taken from one of my mentors and the body of work I've studied, somatic experiencing. So I got to give credit to that, and Peter Levine, who is currently still alive, teaching
Yes.
and doing this work in his 70s. We define trauma as not something that's in the event per se, and I'll get into that, but something that is within the physiology, within the nervous system, within the tissues, within the organs, obviously within the brain, everything. And so sometimes people hear the word trauma and they immediately think an accident, right? And even, and I'll sort of say, if we think of a hospital, you go to the trauma ward, or and that makes sense too. Like there's a blunt trauma, there's an accident, you're going to take care of that trauma in the trauma ward, the trauma nurse, et cetera. So that's another side if we consider first responders and the medical world, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And then in terms of the nervous system world and the somatic world and working with stored stressors, stored survival stress in the body, we would say that trauma is the nervous system being dysregulated. And in a way that is perpetual. It's not just, the burn you get when you hit the toaster when you're trying to get your toast out too fast. Like that's like an ouch, that's a shock to the system. But trauma that is kind of long-standing within the system is a dysregulation of the nervous system, and that's what we'll obviously get into today.
Right. So that is the post-traumatic stress or the complex post-traumatic stress. So post-traumatic is one event, correct? And complex is multiple events over an extended period of time.
That's kind of how we define it. I like examples. So my husband, who's also a colleague, and I'm allowed to talk about him. He's given me free right to use his case. He was brought up in a really abusive, toxic environment. He has a lot of early adversity, lots of money, lots of food on the table, lots of shelter, but there was tension. Parents were divorced, abusive father, emotionally unpresent mother, mentally ill mother. And so there's a lot of tension and stress. And then of course, teenagers, there's those stresses and not fitting in and all these things. And so when I met him, he had what we would classify as complex post-traumatic stress. Even though he hadn't been in a battle, he hadn't been in a massive car accident, he wasn't, left for dead anywhere. But he had complex post-traumatic stress, PTSD, and it was showing up with intense social anxiety, very, very bad gut problems, really, really bad, what we would consider irritable bowel, bad, just bad desire to take care of his body. He didn't have the energy to get out and exercise. Addiction was a big problem for him, with obviously alcohol, low-level drugs, and also pornography, right? And so he was kind of that poster child for, well, there's nothing wrong with you. How could there be anything wrong with you? You went to a good university, you lived in Palo Alto, you look fine, you're educated. But then if you were to go into his actual physiology, right. So to go back to what I was saying about trauma is in the physiology, it was a mess. He either had chronic diarrhea that was terrible or constipated, lots of body pain, all these things that when you look at a person, you don't see it, And they might know that that's happening, but it's just become the norm. And so they just think it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when I met him, he was actually hiding in the woods, no joke, working at a retreat center where you had a really simple life because he couldn't handle real, and it's not kind of the best thing to say, but real life. And real life,
Yeah.
as we know, also is a bit weird the way that we have to do things. But he couldn't handle the normal things that a lot of people can do, and they haven't had that kind of stress growing up. And so met him, and slowly over the course of a few years, he started to understand what was actually happening in the physiology. He was dealing with a dysregulated nervous system. So his trauma was in his cells, it was in the patterns, and also in how he related to people, right? Because his environment was abusive. And so everyone must be abusive. Everyone must be feared.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And I think that's so wonderful to be able to have people understand that there could be things manifesting in their body and they have absolutely no idea that it's trauma. It
Mhm.
could be something that they don't even remember that happened to them.
Yes.
And you have something wonderful on the YouTube video, just I think recently posted, that there are 5 different examples of trauma
Yeah.
that can happen to somebody, and they will have manifestations that they might not even, from delivery of a baby, not having any remembrance, of course, of somebody using forceps or something
Yes.
traumatic that may have
Yes.
happened to them, earlier, plus
Uh-huh.
intergenerational trauma, which
Yeah.
hopefully we'll be able to get into. But
Mhm.
one of the things I love about your teaching is that you build this foundation, and you use this wonderful example at one point that it's like building a house. And
Yes.
that was so clear to me. I would love if you would talk about that a little bit,
Mhm.
about what the process is and how you build it, how it helps you
Mhm.
to have,
Mhm.
and how it's essential to have that foundation.
Yeah. So if we think about when a human being is born, or when even a human being is conceived, there's instant energy. It's a pretty complex process to raise a human that's in society, healthy, able to take care of themselves fully. I mean, anyone that has children knows this, that you can't just pop them out and within 3 days, like a deer, they're walking and knowing how to graze, right? And the reason why is our brain, and our brain specifically, and a portion of our nervous system is quite complex. And so, and I'll get to the house analogy in a second.
Sure.
So if we think of that newborn baby that comes out, they're 100% dependent on the caregiver, whether it's the mother, the nanny, the grandma who's looking after them. 100%. If you left a newborn baby alone and didn't take care of it, it would die, right? It's not going to survive. And it's the same with a lot of animals in the wild, but they have a little more self-sufficiency.
Right.
And so let's just say hypothetically, little baby comes out and they have the good nurturing that they need. So from the point of a human, we need a lot of social connection, right? We need to be talked to, we need to be rocked, we need to be tended to when we cry, when we're hungry, when we're scared, when our diapers are full with stuff and it doesn't feel comfortable. We need constant connection, care. It's called attachment, attunement, all these buzzwords in kind of that world. And we want it so that we build a portion of our nervous system that can do something called self-regulate. I think you've probably heard that word in some of the videos
Yes.
you watched of mine. And so
Yes.
when a newborn baby comes out, they have a little bit of self-regulation. Like, again, if you have a full-term baby, they know how to poop and pee, no problem. We know that, right? And they don't have this other capacity to soothe themselves, to calm themselves down. So that primary interaction at the beginning through the caregiver teaches the infant how to work in this world,
Right.
how to emotionally calm down, how to perk up, how to notice all these things. And we need that really good modeling. That, from what we know, when we get that good modeling in those first 3 years of life, sets us up to have robustness in our entire system. in terms of immune health, social health, gut health, cardiovascular health, even our higher brain is going to be better developed when we have that really strong connection. Safety, very important when we're young. So that's the scenario of like what we want.
Right.
Sadly, not everybody gets that in the human world because our culture and our society has gone so far away from the basics of biology because of this higher brain, right? It's so complex. I mean, look at what it's created, these Zoom calls and the computer. I'm still amazed that airplanes fly, you know, like it's really incredible if you stop for a moment to think that the humans, at least on planet Earth, were the only ones who have figured out how to do this. You know, the giraffes haven't figured it out, the primates haven't figured it out, we figured it out. And so that means that we've got this level of complexity that's almost too hard to understand. And so when we don't get that proper wiring in our biology at the beginning, the safety, the attachment, the connection, the security, being fed when we're hungry, not being left to cry ourselves to sleep, all these things, when we don't get that, the wiring isn't like, my hands are here, so hopefully you're watching this, people are watching this.
Yes.
Like it's like the wires have been dangling, wanting to come together, but they haven't had the environmental nurture for them to go. So they're kind of just hanging out here.
Right.
And what that leads to, and the research has shown this specifically with some research called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which if we don't get into, we can link for people to learn more about it. We know when there has been adversity, not enough attunement, connection, safety is really the main thing. When there's not enough safety and care and connection, similar to how my husband was raised, our capacity to stave off stress and deal with intensity is not as high. We're more likely to get PTSD if we have an accident. We're more likely to end up with a chronic illness like fibromyalgia or autoimmune or cancer or heart disease. All those conditions are super connected to early adversity and not healing at that nervous system trauma in the body level. So to go back to the foundation, building a house example, when we think about building a house, often we think, oh, you got to lay the foundation, and that's true. But if you've ever built a house, before you even do that, you need to have where you're going to build it. You have to have the desire to build it. You need an architect, usually an engineer. You need blueprints. You need all the mechanical pieces to know that this thing can be built in that place. It's not going to fall over. You're going to get the right. So you have a lot of planning, right, before you build a house. And then the planning happens. You start the build, you lay the, you pour the concrete for the foundation. Then you have to let it set and sit. Then you start to bring the lumber and all the things in. And I'm not a builder, but I've seen enough houses built around my neighborhood that I it's the process, right?
Right.
And then you wouldn't decide to put the fixtures and the lights in when you don't have the roof on yet. Right? You wouldn't buy the paint, at least I don't think you would, until there's walls to be painted on. And so if we think about someone who knows that they didn't have a good early start, or they know they're suffering from complex PTSD or one of these chronic illnesses that I've mentioned, or a mental illness or something like that, high levels of anxiety, fear, panic, not wanting to socialize, not having an energy for life. These are all signs of stored trauma. We have to go back to the basics and be like, where do we need to start? And usually, typically, a lot of practices start with trying to buy the paint first.
Right.
Or they start by trying to put the fixtures in, or trying to put the beams before you have a structure. And we can get into that. But from my experience, we need to start with education. That's like right?
Yes.
Real deep education, probably deeper than what we're going to get into in this hour. Understanding the different branches of the nervous system, understanding intimately the fight, flight responses, the shutdown, freeze response, understanding that early upbringing, a lot of people don't realize that their early upbringing wasn't that solid, secure nest egg, that, like beautiful connection, because maybe they weren't beaten, maybe they weren't assaulted by their parents, maybe they actually had a lot of goodness, but there are these little tiny things that put a little person into stress and strain, and that stays with them for life if they're not actively looking at that deeper stuff and working with it. So this house foundation concept or analogy, it's to depict the importance of each individual knowing where they're at. Maybe they had a good foundation and they kind of went astray with too much work that was too stressful, or maybe they had a car accident later in life and they don't know, I was healthy as a kid. Something went off when I did this. And so it's about tracing and tracking and kind of being, I like to say, a private investigator of your own body.
Yeah.
Right. It's like I was a generation of Magnum PI, so I always think of Magnum PI, and it is Red Ferrari, searching for clues and all that. And he was a little different, and it's kind of like we're being that Magnum PI, trying to figure out where along the path did this get thrown off, and then learning how to feel into that, and not denying the intuition that might be like, no, actually, I think it was something that happened when I was really young. Or, oh gosh, right, my mother was very stressed because her father died the day that I was born, or something like that. When you start to hear people's histories and you ask and you see, like, wow, I would never have thought that death of my mother's, I'm just making this up, my mother's father the day I was born is why she just wasn't able to be present with me, because she was dealing with this newborn baby and the death of someone that she cared about. Right. And so that's a traumatic thing for a baby. Right. Even though they're not hurt, the environment is high stress.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does. And one thing I would love to sort of extending that thought is very often there's a fear of going deep for a veteran or for someone who has survived trauma, but they don't remember it. They don't know what happened. But you wrote or had also a video on the fact that you don't have to be re-traumatized to work and get healed from trauma. And that is so significant, because I think that's one thing. I remember having a conversation with my sister. Our mother died when we were young, and we're away at camp and came home and she was gone.
Oh.
And we were living in a different house. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was really traumatic, but it was never processed for me at all. It was just, well, she's not here anymore, and we're in a
life goes on.
And life goes on. But of course, that was a trauma that even if I were to revisit it, I wouldn't have necessarily known what to say. It's like, of course, that was a horrible event. But for people, my sister said, well, what if you don't remember? Isn't it dangerous for you to dig those memories up? And I said, well, you don't have to dig them up. They'll come up. But you need to know what to do when they do come up. And I love the way you address that is you don't have to go, and one of the therapies at the VA is this prolonged exposure therapy. And I have a problem with that.
You too.
So I would love for you to address the fact that a trauma survivor does not have to fear that. Getting help.
Well, 100%. And thanks for sharing your story too, when you were young. And so what's interesting is that this is where it gets a little dicey, because someone might end up re-traumatizing themselves and reliving, not completely, because reliving means going back, literally time traveling and reliving it. And at this point, we don't know how to do that. So, but it's remembering and re-traumatizing themselves. It can happen when the practices and the methodologies that are being used are not working under the very strong principles of what I call and what is known to be neuroplastic healing. And then I say neuroplastic healing sequencing. As I kind of made the joke, you wouldn't put the fixture on the house when you don't have the blueprints yet, because it would just fall to the ground, right? And smash. You don't want to go into a type of therapy that is highly activating if the person doesn't yet know how to listen to basic physiological responses internally. And what's happening right now is because trauma is becoming a big buzzword.
Yeah.
In popular press. And I'm glad that's happening, because it's showing that people are realizing, oh my goodness, there's this other piece that we haven't been neglecting. We've been trying to meditate. We've been trying to do all these things. We've been trying to eat well, and eating well is very important. Exercise, very important. All the heat hygiene around sleep, all very important. But people are finally going, oh, there's this trauma piece, and it's stuck in the system. It's stuck in the nervous system. And so what everyone wants is a real quick fix to try to get that stuff out of the body as quickly as possible, the way you would get rid of a bacterial infection with a course of antibiotics. And I'm all for an antibiotic when it really needs to be given, but when there is old traumatic stress stored in the system from early on, from a very intense event or series of events, you have to realize that the human system is not built to pry that stuff out in one day, or even in 1 month, or even in some cases 1 year. It sometimes and often takes time. And so from my experience with the blending of the work I've put together with all my trainings and such, rather than me sitting in front of someone and saying, oh, hey, Jane, tell me about that time you found out what happened in your body when you found out your mother was gone. And I'm sure you've done therapy on it, so that's why I'm comfortable asking you that right now.
Yeah.
I sense that. Like, I would not just meet you on a first session and just dig into the biggest, scariest, most painful thing that you've probably experienced in your life. We would talk about the weather that day. We would, and I would watch the physiology, and I'd be like, what would it be like to just feel your pelvis on your chair? Can you sense that connection with the chair? Can you sense that as I'm talking, you're nodding your head, right? And can you sense that there's a room around you? It's like some of the real basic elements of, I'm here, I'm in this place, this home, I've got this chair under me, yep, I'm talking to this person, you've got your earbuds in, oh, that necklace, like, what is that? Like, there's these ways of building the foundation, laying the blueprints, creating the blueprints, slowly reconnecting the person to their body. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. So that when those old memories and those old procedures that are stored in the body, we'll also talk about that, start to move and come out, the person doesn't clamp down. And what often happens is when a flashback comes up, because to me, there's flashbacks and there's memories. Flashbacks have like a negative connotation because they're scary and we don't know what to do with them. But really, a flashback is a memory, right? And the key is can we have that memory bubble up and surface in a way that we don't go into more of a survival response? And so re-traumatizing ourselves when we're dealing with a past event, it happens when we go more into survival, more into fight, flight, or shutdown. And then that's why a lot of folks stay away from working with their traumas, because they've had a little bit of experience doing therapies where they're just trying to put the fixture on quickly because they want the house to be built. They want it all to be gone. And I say, and my colleagues say, what if we reverse engineer and do like a 180-degree shift? And rather than trying to excavate all the bad, scary stuff that ever happened to you and all the things that you saw and all the things that you did that you didn't like, let's just not talk about that. Let's just, like, can you feel your butt on the chair? Right. Can you feel your hands? Can you let your hands touch your own body? And the reason I keep saying the body is when we are put in a situation where there are really bad things happening around us, especially if we're in the military. We've been trained. I haven't been trained, but I know people have been trained to go into situations and be okay in the highest amount of stress. It's wired into the system for good reason, to do the job, to not get killed, and to help others in the process. That is overriding the physiology's desire to get the heck out of Dodge.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to really let that person, like, I don't want to be here, even though that's the training and that's the job, it's like there is an override happening, but the unconscious is scared so much, right? Scared completely. And when we go into that auto mode, automatic mode that we've learned due to training, what we're denying is the somatic body that actually wants to get the heck out of there. Does that make sense?
It does. I think one of the things too is one of the resistance storylines that I hear often is, I can't talk to this person because this person isn't in the military. This person didn't go through combat. And I think your approach really says that's not the issue. You're putting a fixture in over here, and we need to talk about something else. And I would love you to address that, because that's enough to have somebody say, I'm checking this box and I'm not going to try that. And I don't
100%.
want them to feel that way.
100%. No, that's a great question. And so if I come back to, I'll blend what I was saying into the next piece, is when we're in that kind of intense, stressful situation where it's life and death and other people's lives are at risk, we will go into an autopilot to do as much as we can to make sure everything is okay, even at the risk of our own person, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that high level of stress, we're disconnecting from the body. We're physically moving, we're physically doing, but it's very much, it's an automatic, impulsive wiring of this is what you do. I know a lot of first responders, you know, when they're in the heat of a really intense thing, they are on autopilot, and a lot of first responders have terrible complex PTSD because the constant barrage of what they see, what they're having to deal with, and they don't have time to let that stress out of the system. Right. It's a very, very interesting thing to work with a first responder, and they're so good at keeping the horror, the scream that they want to scream when they see what they see from going out. And yet when I've worked with them, they've been able to start to get that intensity out of their systems by touching into some of those moments, but not completely immersing into them. And so the thing that's fascinating about this work, at least from the nervous system perspective and the body perspective, and understanding how we store fight, flight, freeze. So I'll maybe just speak to that really quickly.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so we've got, so I keep saying nervous system. So we all have a brain and a spinal cord, right? That's the central nervous system. Very high function, you know, spinal cord is just, it does its thing automatically, right? And then we have the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, it's called the peripheral nervous system. So periphery meaning I can see the periphery, it's anything that isn't central. So central is brain, spinal cord, peripheral comes out, it's the autonomic nervous system. And so like if I take a glass up, like my tea, I do that, I'm doing that without having to think. My peripheral nerves, my brain is sending a signal saying, pick up tea to show Jane that I can do this. It's happening with quick peripheral nervous system connections through my muscles, etc. If there was a big loud bang outside of my, like there's actually a guy fixing some stuff in our basement right now. If he was all of a sudden do a big bang, I might have a little jump. And it's not because I know that his tools are going to come up and shoot me, but it's because it startles me. That muscular startle is my autonomic nervous system responding to the environment. The fight flight is let's just say my fire alarms start to go off, which they probably won't, but let's just say all of a sudden there's smoke, they go off. I might say, Jane, see ya, I gotta go. I gotta get out of here. I gotta get rid of this smoke. It's like an emergency. I would flee, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
The other response of the autonomic nervous system is the shutdown response. So we have fight, flight, and freeze. So that's the common thing that we're like, I saw something really scary. I shut down. I couldn't move. We hear this a lot with people who've been physically assaulted, sexually assaulted. They'll say, I froze. I couldn't move.
Yeah.
Same even with medical procedures. Little kids will go into a shutdown knowing that they have to stay really still for something that's happening to them. And so we've got these autonomic nervous system responses, fight, flight, freeze, that we need, right? I want to protect myself if I drop a knife when I'm cutting onions, right? That kind of thing. You know, if you've driven, you probably drive, and many people drive. You know, you're driving and you miss something really quickly. You know, whether it's an animal or a person, you go into automatic.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why that's important is that the nervous system doesn't really know the difference between a trauma that happened in a car accident versus a traumatic event that happened falling off of a cliff versus being screamed at by your parent for 10 years as a child versus waking up in the middle of a surgery versus physical assaults, seeing something that is so horrific that your whole body goes into shutdown. The nervous system doesn't have this little thing that says, okay, when you were this old, you had this. What it records is the stress, the survival stress. One thing that it does record, so I'm going to give you another example, if that's okay.
Love it.
It's my classic example. So let's just say I'm on a soccer field and a soccer ball comes to my head and I see it and I'm able to do this, right? I'm able to protect. I'm able to do this movement. But if anyone's ever had that happen, they know it happens instantly, right? Just like I can pick up my glass and I don't have to think about it.
Right.
If a person, for whatever reason, doesn't see that ball, let's say they're being distracted by someone saying, hey, Irene, I'm over here. Like we just arrived to the game. And I look and I go hi and then poof. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a chance to automatically protect from that ball, but I get hit. My system is then wanting to protect. There is a written, it's called procedural memory. There's a procedure in the system that wanted to do that and it didn't, and then you get hurt because you didn't have a chance to protect. We could take this example to people who have been, assaulted, car accidents where you had to press the gas but you couldn't because if you did you would have hit someone else, and so you're in a bind. Right. I want to do this but I can't, and so I freeze. I saw that thing happen. I wanted to do this but I couldn't because I wasn't supposed to. I mean, I'm sure that the people watching this will have bells or maybe going off, light bulbs of things where they wanted to do something and they couldn't, or they had to do something and they didn't want to. Right. Their moral compass knows somewhere deep down, this doesn't feel good, but this is my job. Right.
And that's creating a moral injury.
Yes.
Yeah.
Spiritual, we could even say, right?
Yes. And that needs to be treated.
Exactly.
Right.
So if we go back to the autonomic nervous system and these, the soccer ball hitting me, replace it, whatever you want to replace it with, there is a part of the body that wants to protect. It wants to protect. It wants to press that gas or press that brake. It wants to hide and say, I don't want to see this anymore. Right? And so part of this work is recognizing that the nervous system doesn't discriminate on whether that was a ball that gave you a concussion, whether it was missiles coming at you. I mean, my mother grew up in the Philippines during the Second World War. She has stories
Gosh.
of
Oh,
hearing
gosh.
the whistles coming from the sky and hiding under tables in their house, right? And so I think about it, and it's like, how would that impact a 5-year-old little girl? You know, huge impact, huge shutdown, right? Because you can't run, even though you want to, because you don't know what's going to happen. And so when doing this work, if the person who is deciding, you know what, I think I want to work on my nervous system. I know I've got these fight, flight, freeze, shutdown responses that I know, like my temper is so big. Like people that are highly, highly in that survival energy have interesting, it's not personality, because it's not the personality, it's reaction, right? Temper goes fast. Shutdown goes real fast, or bolting. I'm out of here, not dealing with this intensity. So if someone is like, I know I do that, and it's hurting me, it's hurting my family, it's hurting my work, it's hurting me even taking care of myself, because this also can provide self-harm if we know we need to do something, but we don't do it because of these shutdown responses. So if someone is like, okay, I got to work on this, what's more important is that the therapist or the people that you work with, that they understand what I've just described.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have been through that exact experience, because we're typically not saying, tell me about everything that occurred. We're starting with where the person's physiology is at in that moment, what we see, and not that we're not interested in the story. And if the story comes up, we will listen to it, but we will in some ways dissect the micro movements that we're seeing, the holding of the jaw, the flushness in the face. There's a beautiful, did you ever watch Peter Levine doing a session with an Iraqi vet named Ray?
Yes. Yes, that was fantastic.
You should link that.
That's
so
great.
They did a long version, and then they did an edited version, but this gentleman was suffering from severe anxiety and tics, like a Tourette tic in his movements. And I forgive me, I don't remember the entire situation, but he was in a situation where there was a massive explosion. And a lot of people died. He was one of the only persons that lived. So then you have survival.
Tremendous survivor's guilt. Yeah.
But because of the explosion, and he didn't see it coming because it was an improvised explosive device. I think that's the right term for it. Apologies if I got that wrong. It's like that soccer ball coming to hit me in the head. You're driving along, everything's fine, and then poof. And so you don't have a moment to react. It just hits you. And so the after effects in his physiology was this needing to defend and orient to the blast, because he didn't have a chance to. And so when you have that kind of a intensity, that kind of sympathetic arousal, fight, flight, and you can't do anything about it because it's happening at the exact same moment you know it's happening, it puts a shock trauma into the nervous system, and the head is constantly looking. And that's where we get these tics and things like this. It's not a mental disorder, in my opinion. It isn't a defect. The neurology is a bit messed up because it's looking to protect and defend. And so when you watch Peter work with Ray, they work through patterns and tension, because he also had horrible headaches. That was the other thing. Patterns of tension that his system was still holding, trying to protect from this explosion. And it's a beautiful story.
It is. We should I'll definitely link to that. I think one of the things that you're addressing here too is that it's not, you're not just working with the brain.
No.
which is what I think so many therapies are doing. They're saying, okay, well, we'll give you these drugs and then you'll sleep and forget about this, that, and the other. And you can't do that. You can't
Yeah.
dismiss it, because as you're describing it, it is not just something that you remember that happened. It is actually happening to every cell in your body.
Yes.
And so you can't just go work from here up. You have to work from here down. And I think a really important part of this is for people to understand that there is no shame, no blame, that this very intricate and complicated system, that, or nervous systems, as you said, it's not just one nervous system.
Many.
That this whole just incredible device that we have that's called our body, it is doing its job.
Yes.
And when it gets into a circumstance in which it tries to fire off and do what it would do normally as an automatic kind of response, then you have to go back and say, well, this is what it's designed to do.
Yes.
So let me understand it, how it works. And like you were talking about driving a car, driving a stick, and not getting that coordination together.
Yeah.
It takes away any kind of sense that this is something that's a personal failing, or you're not man enough, or you're not a hero enough.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with that at all. It's
No.
the way this very complex machine is designed for our survival protection.
100%.
And then we have to go understand how it works. And one thing that you had described, when you talk about neuroplasticity and the ability of the brain to heal, you're talking also that this is a very systematic way that you're working, like back to the foundation. Yeah. And so you really need to understand what's happening to you, instead of just saying, I felt this, I have, tremendous anxiety. I can't sleep. It's like, okay, where is that happening? How do we go back and trace that wire? Which I think is such a beautiful way to really understand this whole process is really fantastic.
It is. And what you said about there being no shame in the system is I have found when my students who have had a whole plethora of different traumas and such, that the system, typically the traditional medical system and even the psychological systems, they fail to really teach the person about what's happening in their body, in their physiology. And I remember having not an argument, but a little bit of a disagreement with someone at a conference once. It wasn't a healing health conference, it was a business conference, and they were also into the nervous system and all these sorts of things, and working with the vagus nerve, which is what I implicitly work with the work that I do. And I said, oh, well, do you teach your students the difference between the high tone and the low tone dorsal of the parasympathetic? Like, I got a little jargony because I was testing them. Like, do you really know about the vagus nerve, or are you just saying that because that's the hot buzzword right now? And you could see the look on his face. He got a little confused. He's like, oh, well, that's not important. All they need are the practices so that they get better. All they care about are results. And I have yes, we want to get results. We want to be able to sleep, not have complex PTSD, have our guts work properly, have our immune system work properly, love our environment properly and with goodness and vitality. And because each human was raised differently and our experiences are so vast and complex, you can't give someone like the sheet of paper with your questions. I can't just say, okay, Jane, start with number 1 and then start with number 2 and then do that 3 times and then we'll get to the next thing. The problem with that kind of protocol, even with mind-body work and meditation, is that a person's system is going to offer up the old memories in a non-linear, often kamikaze fashion. And so we need to make sure that the person embarking on this deep level of work, which from what I've seen is one of the better ways to work with old traumatic stressors, that they're prepared, that they're equipped. You wouldn't ask someone, go get dropped off at Everest Base Camp and just start hiking on day one. It's impossible. First of all, you couldn't do that, and they wouldn't, like, you have to acclimatize. You've got to get fit. You have to have your gear, your supplies. That's ethically not good to do that. And so there needs to be this foundational aspect, this teaching. And from my experience, when people learn the intricacies, it gives them empowerment.
Absolutely.
Because when they are then sitting up at night with their heart pounding for no reason, waking up from a nightmare, they're like, okay, obviously my system is trying to process old survival stress. You may not have any idea what event it is, because usually it doesn't, this level of deep panic and fear has often not a memory. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to be like, okay, I've learned that I turn on the lights, sit up, maybe I have to walk a bit, maybe I have to have a drink of water, maybe I just need to see my room and name some things that are in my room to reorient. You then kind of go into a self-directed approach, as opposed to every time I wake up and I have this is what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the work at this level takes a little bit more time at the beginning. And when you lay those foundations, you then have, and you have the blueprints, it's like you're becoming your own medicine. You're not needing to have a specific script for everything depending on the circumstance, because it's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And as we build more ability to be with the scary stuff that does come up, the biology reciprocates in return. It actually gives you more resilience, more healing. And what you said about the brain is 100% bang on. There's many in my field, and my teachers have said that the brain is an end organ, just like the gut, just like the hormone system, just like the reproductive system. But what drives the health or dis-ease of these organ systems is the physiological autonomic stress response. Because again, I mentioned that peripheral nervous system, it doesn't just go to one place.
Right. Right.
It goes everywhere, right? And it even gives us our capacity to connect with other people and the environment, right? So the brain is important, clearly.
Sure.
If we were to remove it, we wouldn't survive. But it's also so intricate that to work with specific parts isn't enough. We need to incorporate the whole system. Hope I'm making sense there.
No, you're absolutely making sense. I think that the training probably in the military is that it gets very black and white. I haven't served, but this is certainly what I'm told, is that, you understand the commands, you understand what you need to do. You're not, thinking about all of this other part below here. And so when you get out of the service and you come home and you're on high alert and you're still in that headspace, being able to get back into your body or thinking, well, my head is working against me, my thoughts are working against me, to be able to connect that to your whole body and understand why is it doing what it's doing, and that it's really not trying to hurt you, it's trying to tell you something.
Yes.
You need to work on, like feelings. You said something at one time that feelings are actually neutral.
Yes.
If you could understand that and understand they're there to tell you something.
Yes.
So it's the curiosity. It's maintaining the curiosity about the system and how it works, and trying to understand that the more you use the education to understand how the system works, the more you are able to liberate yourself from shutting down, and you're able to become open to knowing that this is my unique machine.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can learn all different kinds of how to drive the stick shift, as long as you can understand this. And I've just become so fascinated with it because I think as a child and throughout my life, I have always been here.
Yeah, most people have.
Yeah.
Well, the school system demanded that of us.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on where we went to school, but for most of us, it was academic, except for that
Right.
1 hour of physical education, if you were lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, it wasn't very fun for a lot of people because it was very competitive,
Right.
And so then you have the people who just weren't into those things would just shut down and do it because they had to get the grade. Maybe some of us had art, maybe we had some music, but most of it, that was like a nice aside. And so we've even trained ourselves as human beings for the most part to be so intellectual, even though this whole system is 100% essential. And what people will realize is that when they're starting to heal and starting to work with the systems, their body system, they're wanting to do that, that when you can work with the sensations and the emotions and honor them for what they are, and sometimes when you honor them for what they are, there's going to be a lot that comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be scary for some people too, right? The amount of held anger and rage that we have gotten so good at holding inside.
Mm-hmm.
Any human would say this, it's like it is like a bomb inside waiting to go off, a lot of the held anger. And the outlet for how we get that stuff out hasn't been refined enough because it's like, oh, we'll just breathe through it. Just go to your happy place,
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's fine when you're in your job, when you're doing that. But when you come back, if that stuff is still stored inside and you didn't get it out, you didn't scream when you saw your best friend blown up, you didn't cry when you saw that village destroyed. Holding all that stuff in, it isn't going to go away with time.
Right.
And what'll happen is it'll store in the system and it'll come out in moments when it isn't probably the best. And so, as you were talking about what you were just saying a second ago, I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if everyone who came back from serving could just have some kind of place to go to decompress? Kind of like people who go up in space, like you can't just go back to normal life. You're completely turned around. You can hardly walk because you've lost your bone mass. And
they do that in other cultures.
There you go.
Yes, they absolutely do that in other cultures. When in Native American cultures, when the warrior comes back from war, they are, I believe they're put into a teepee with a group of others, and they are allowed this time to be able. Yeah, they're not ready to go right in. So it's very interesting to definitely see that in cultures. And one of the other things I just want to mention before we close here, I could talk to you for like days and months. I could move to Canada or, to Vancouver. But one of the things I think that's really critical, because trauma has become, as you said, such a buzzword now, and people are really beginning to see that basically at the root of all human problems is trauma in one way or another, including addiction and all kinds of things. How important it is that somebody, and I think the way you described it with the person when you were giving them sort of the little test about the different systems, it's, when somebody says they are a trauma therapist, are they trauma curious? Are they trauma interested? Are they trauma drive-through? It's
that's funny. That's
really, but it's so important that you really measure that they know what they're talking about when they're talking about trauma, that it's not getting into other stuff.
That's a very good point, because and this is just what I've seen experience-wise in all my years of doing this, is just because someone has a psychology degree a clinical counseling degree, actually social workers I found are some of the better folks because they're a little more
Yes.
social, right? Like
Right.
they're looking
Right.
at the bigger picture actually. But a lot of the classically trained therapists, and I have a lot of friends who are in this boat who have gone to the other side and brought in the somatic pieces because they want to offer the best possible holistic treatment protocol and approach. But there is no actual designation yet for someone who is trained with the capacities to be somatic healing trained.
And can you define somatic? So
yeah, and this is where there's like, it's kind of like, you know how we have defined medicine. We know medicine is a thing. You go to medical school, you become a doctor. This work is still so new,
right,
that there isn't like a definition of this is what a somatic therapist is. This is what a trauma trained somatic therapist is. My interests right now are in that zone, trying to find a way to make that definition and make that schooling happen.
That's wonderful.
But what a person has to look for, is you gotta kind of interview the person.
Yes.
And I actually did a video on how to find a good somatic practitioner, so we'll be sure to
wonderful.
That. But it's
wonderful.
like, you have to ask them what their credentials are. Somatic experiencing is definitely one of the gold standards. But just because someone has that doesn't mean they're going to necessarily be good, right? Because you can go through the motions and not have it embodied, right? And so someone who says that they're trauma informed, for example, they might understand that there's trauma in the nervous system and this stuff works, but if they're not embodying it in their own body, it's not going to be as effective. Right. Because they're going off of a list of things about what the theory says, but we need the education, but the therapist or the practitioner also has to have the practical know-how to not only do this work, but live it and breathe it.
Right.
It's not like an orthopedic surgeon, for example, who can have a terrible bedside manner, but be really good at fixing knees.
Right.
Right. And we probably, some people might know some of those surgeons where they have no social skills, but they are darn good at their job. Right. This is one of those situations where they need to be darn good at their job and they have to have really good social skills. Because when you have that really good social engagement, juiciness, the person can really feel and see the nuances and the tiny little micro expressions. They can feel, I can feel in my gut when something goes off in a client's gut. And you won't have that if you've only done a few hours here and there learning about this stuff on a few webinars like this. Like it's not, so there's kind of this, it's like the Wild West in some ways right now.
It is. Yeah.
In the healing trauma somatic world. So there's not really a definition. I would say ask the questions. Ask them if they know about the different branches of the nervous system and how they work. And the polyvagal theory is something that is kind of standard now for everyone to understand. But even I've experienced that that's not taught 100% the way it should be in context that's proper. So it's kind of exciting because
I agree.
It asks for the person seeking out the work to be keenly interested. And, you know, if there's no credentials on a person's site or anything like that, then that's kind of a bit suspicious, right? You want to make sure that they not only understand the theory, but they are doing the work in their own systems and they've gone through enough training. And because the trainings are scattered, you know, I have got 2 degrees and 3 different trainings under my belt that were all separate. So a lot of us, my generation, I'm in my mid-40s, and some of my colleagues who are into their 60s, we've had to like find the things, right? And then we put them together. So I don't know if that was just confusing what I said, but
not at all.
Okay, good. It's, you know, for those that are listening who are brand new, I think the most important thing is to understand that the body doesn't lie. If we haven't been listening to our body, it might not talk to us very clearly yet. And so we have to start listening to it, and we have to start honoring that it went into those protection modes for a reason. It's holding that
Right.
anger for a reason.
Right.
Crying and getting emotions out, they're there for a reason. And at the end of the day, the systems of the body, they don't want to be stuck in survival.
Right.
When they're stuck in survival, the outcome is not favorable to our health.
Right.
And we know that. We know that through a lot of research. If we do not work at this level and work with these fight, flight, freeze responses and work at building capacity in the system, the research is pretty conclusive. We will end up getting sick in some way.
Right.
Whether it's mental, emotional, physical, addiction, relational, purpose-driven, or all of the above, the system can't prosper and be what we would call a favorite word of mine recently, pro-immunity. We can't be in pro-immunity when the gears are grinding.
Right.
Right? Like fight, flight, one of the better examples is, and you've probably heard me say this, Jane, is if you think about fight, flight as the gas, and you think of freeze as the e-brake, it's very, when you have you can't do this on a standard, but if you have an automatic car and you try to drive it with the e-brake on, you can feel immediately something's not right, and oh, right, gotta let that down, right? If you think about the human system, if there are old survival stressors, fight, flight in the system, there's going to be a freeze response to keep those from exploding, right?
Right.
And a person might not even know that they're holding those fight, flight responses, those procedural memories of the ball hitting them, seeing something they didn't want to see. They've buried it so cleverly inside, because that's what keeps us going on. You know, if we didn't, we would just lay in a heap and never get up. So these frozen, freezy parts protect us so that we can be functional. But what we don't realize is in doing that, all the other systems in the body, it's like the e-brake is on and we're trying to push the gas, we're trying to go. And the one thing I forgot to mention, just to loop it, that fight, flight, freeze autonomic nervous system that governs, you know, my ability to want to fight or leave or shut down, it's also what governs all of our physiological systems. Wow. So everything that happens in here, heart, respiration, acid base, gut, immune, reproductive system, our brain, our fluids, all of that, our hunger cues, our ability to love and connect, but also our ability to sense danger. So when that brake is on the gas, it's going to impact the whole system. So I guess it's like, it's kind of sometimes a little daunting to decide to go into a different kind of work when maybe your doctor's never heard of it, maybe your therapist doesn't work with it, maybe the VA doesn't work with it, you know, but it really, as you start to get into this and you feel into it, I haven't met many people in my world who hear this information and go, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And I don't mean all the intricacies, but most people understand fight, flight, protection. I know that I shut down. I know that I go into a rage. My blood boils for no reason. That is not the brain. That's the physiology in a looping pattern from old stuff.
And I think that's so, it absolutely makes sense. I think that it's just so fantastic. And I want people to know, and we will link all these resources to your website, to the tremendous number of YouTube videos that you have with just fantastic explanations, courses, online courses that you provide for understanding and helping reset your nervous system. There's just so much that you have contributed to all of this understanding, and I'm really excited to be able to share it with veterans for them to know. If there was just one sort of closing thing you could say that would offer hope to someone that says, you know what, I've been at my wit's end, I'm at the end of my rope, I don't want to go on, that sounds hard. Can you tell them that
Mm.
You know, why should they explore? What, you know, that it will open, as Daryl Hammond said, he did that, it's all trauma. That he had been misdiagnosed and misprescribed for probably 50 years. He said it was like the Hallelujah Choir. And that's the way I feel about this too. It's like, okay, now first you get its trauma, and now you get this part, and it's like the Hallelujah Choir. It's really exciting. So I just wonder, obviously from your perspective, I'm sure you feel that way too, but
I do. You know, it's funny. I'm going to give you that answer. And another resource just came to mind. My brain's just firing fast today. There are two other resources that I will tell you. One is a book called Tribes. I always forget if it's Tribes or Tribe, by Sebastian Junger. Did you know about that one? So that I so recommend. He was a war journalist, was in the thick of the thick. And he realized when he was back home in New York in the subway that he probably had PTSD, and he wasn't even fighting. He was, but he was in it, right?
Right.
So his book is beautiful. It's called On Homecoming and Belonging. It's a short book. I'm sure it's on audio as well. But the other book that I just remembered when you said that about your past guest, and I don't know who he is, so I'll have to look him up. Daryl, was it?
Daryl Hammond, yes, Saturday Night Live comedian. He's there's
my God. Okay.
There's a
I thought that name was familiar.
Yeah, there's a terrific film that he did with Michelle Ezrick. It's on Netflix now, and it's a documentary of this story. It's so compelling, and it's called Cracked Up.
Okay.
And it is all about trauma.
Awesome.
And how not knowing about it completely changes the trajectory of your life. And when you find out that that's what it is, you suddenly go, gosh, none of this was my fault.
No.
You know, and it's just,
if anything, the body had to do that to survive.
Absolutely.
So if anyone is ever, this is kind of, anyone who's watching this, who's alive right now, obviously everybody is alive. It's like you're here because your physiology has been in your favor.
Right.
And so the other book I thought of when you mentioned that, I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but
sure.
I've held myself back. There's a man by the name of Clint Malarchuk. He's a Canadian retired NHL hockey player who's in the National Hockey League. And he wrote a book called, it's different in the States versus Canada, On the Crease and Beyond. He was a goalie. So he was the goalie for I forget what team, and in Canada. And he, in history, apparently his injury was the worst injury recorded in all of sport history. He had his jugular.
I know exactly who you're.
I get gory goosebumps.
That was horrifying. Oh my God, yes.
Yeah. So he had a skate blade go to his jugular vein. He survived, obviously. Yeah. He went back to play like days later. Anyway, his story is beautiful. I really recommend the book. It's about the intensity, the drinking, the partying in the NHL, then his addictions, his anger, losing his family. I mean, it was just it's like an intense story. Yeah. And he went into all these rehab centers, and finally he was at the center somewhere in, I think, the Bay Area in San Francisco, in California. And he was given Peter Levine's book. I think it was Waking the Tiger, because this was before Peter had written his other books. He's reading the book, and he had this great therapist who was clearly trained in somatic. And she was just, he's like, she was a little different because she wasn't like the other shrinks that just wanted to get into my head and blow it up and figure me out. She just kind of like you would, an owner would treat a dog who's been beaten and abused. You don't try to shake them out of their trauma. Right. You got to be gentle and slow and put their food out. And when they want it, they come. You don't force. So he's reading Peter Levine's book, and he read some chapter, and his words were, "Well, fuck me. How come no one told me this before? Because I would have not gone through all the stuff, all the rehab centers, all of this, trying to sort out my problems and my history. It's just in my physiology. Like, it was so great to read that because I remember reading it and just like, ha, another one, right? And he's super funny, and he's just, it's a really good book. He's written it himself, and it's just so good. So I really recommend that.
That's great. We'll
It's
put
so
that
great.
in the resource.
Yeah, I've been meaning to try to get a
Absolutely.
hold of him actually. But so to answer your question, my final words, or some of them, would be that our healing, when we heal at this level, we're healing everything. So I'm a big believer that each human being is a cell of the planet, just like all the trillions of cells in our body make up the human system.
Mhm.
We're part of this world, whether we like it or not.
Right.
And some people, not everyone, it helps to see a bigger picture.
Mhm.
Just like sometimes I hear people will push on because they want to see their grandchildren grow up. You know, they want to experience things. They don't want to leave because they want to see these things. Not everyone's gonna like that, because that sometimes is too daunting. But if the simple thing is, by healing at this level, you are contributing a little bit or a lot to the bigger picture.
Mhm.
And the more healthy we become as humans, the healthier our environment, the healthier and more robust and resilient our environment is, because we impact the energy all around us.
Right.
And you know, the students I've worked with, they'll say the simplest things, like, I actually have helped the person that I order my coffee from every day smile a bit more because I know how to engage with them differently. Or I now smile at the kids at the park in a different way and they light up. You know, like, there's little tiny things. Or we could look at it in a bigger universal way, but the more we heal ourselves, the more we impact the environment, and we need that right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Someone had said to me that we are impacted by 7 generations on one side, and then what we do with our individual life will impact 7 generations in the future. And I just think that's so powerful.
Yeah.
So it's knowing that your story is, you're here for a reason, and that
Yep.
understanding how your machine works is part of that
Definitely.
process.
And
So
I'll say one thing to what you just said there. I believe that we impact every single generation.
yes, yes,
Because
yes.
I think if that study, I don't remember the exact study, but I think that was a study that was done on worms, maybe. I can't remember. But it was like nematodes or something. And in science, they'll only give you as much as they can study, right? So they found that the genetic material was passed down over 7 generations. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was nematodes. But my gut is, if you were to keep studying those in different ways, that you would see that it transfers through the whole. But the cool thing is that when we heal ourselves now, I am a big believer that it goes both forward and back,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
If
Yeah.
very quantum Einstein kind of principles, that time
Mhm.
is all happening now. And I've
Mhm.
seen family systems, people who have started to heal their stuff, and family members that they're not in contact with will then contact them out of the blue, estranged people, because they're changing their own physiology. And our nervous system, at least in my world and how I see it, it's intimately connected with the energy of the universe.
Yeah.
And so there's a very, it's not a religious component, it's a very strong spiritual, bigger picture component. And
Mhm.
when we are shifting ourselves, we're shifting everything that is connected
Yes.
to us. And I think that, in essence, is, if you really land on that, that's pretty special.
Yeah. It's really special.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Irene. What a
Welcome.
delight to be
Yeah,
able to speak with you. I just enjoyed every second.
it was
And
fun.
I look forward to sharing this with so many others. And we will put all your resources and help them connect to you and all your good work.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for
Thank
everyone
you.
listening.
Thank you so much. Take
All right.
care, Irene, and hope to see you soon.
Ciao. See ya.
Okay. Bye-bye.